now we move on to the main business of this evening, to debate the motion before the House, this House will decolonise the curriculum. On the proposition, we have Dr. Christina Mobley, former coordinator of decolonising the curriculum at Newcastle, and a classics lecturer at Newcastle University. We have Mr. Charles Aldous, our favourite President-X, and a holder of the Naval School academic expedition, and Mr. Shahzen Chauhan, second year philosophy and math student at Collingwood College. On the opposition, we start with Professor Ian Pace, who is a musicologist, historian and sociologist at the City St George's University. We have Professor Lawrence Goldman, the Executive Director of History Reclaimed and Professor of Modern History at Oxford. And we have Mateusz, who is a student member at South College. I now would like to invite Dr. Mobley to open the case for the proposition.
Thank you for the invitation to speak here tonight. It's indeed an honor. I know that decolonising the curriculum is a topic that's often highly politicized, so I'm looking forward to an intellectual debate this evening, gentlemen. I want to start with a story that I think illustrates some of the central misconceptions about the decolonising the curriculum movement. In the summer of 2020, during the Black Lives Matter movement, the BBC asked me to give an interview about the Northeast's connections to slavery. The interview, which was filmed just after the removal of the Colston statue in Bristol, took place in front of the Grey Monument, which some of you may know, in Newcastle. And I explained that the Northeast, in fact, had a deep connection to anti-slavery, having hosted a Lauda Equiano, Frederick Douglass. In fact, two Quaker sisters, the Richardson sisters, raised the money to purchase Frederick Douglass's freedom. Newcastle University gave an honorary doctorate to Martin Luther King Jr. And of course, the Grey Monument celebrates the achievements of one second Earl Grey, which included the abolition of slavery in the British Empire. So you would imagine my surprise when shortly thereafter I received a call from the head of the university PR, who wanted to let me know she'd had to notify the police of some rather concerning comments made about me by a far-right group who had taken umbrage with my characterization of the Northeast as not historically a racist region. I suppose everything's comparative, isn't it? The same group soon organized a counter-protest to protect the monument, which resulted in a somewhat absurd situation in which Black Lives Matter supporters and these counter-protesters were facing off at the monument. The former was there because they, of Gray's connection to abolishing slavery, and the latter was there chucking glass bottles at everyone, I suppose because they imagined they were protecting the monument, which I suppose they thought was to some racist imperialists, and the entire situation was highly absurd. And I begin with this anecdote because I think it highlights the fact that much of the debate around decolonising the curriculum is based on fundamental misunderstandings, misperceptions, and fear-mongering. In fact, expanding the curriculum is nothing new. A generation ago, we had the same debates about including women. A generation before that, E.P. Thompson opened the debate to include the working classes. Expanding the curriculum is part and parcel of the intellectual process of debate and achievement. So what is the decolonising movement? Decolonising the curriculum asks us to recognize our own positionality, bias, context. And it asks us to do the same of our sources, which is fundamental in the historical disciplines to primary source analysis. It asks us to recognize that we are all shaped by fundamental assumptions about the way the world works. We all have assumptions. It's how babies learn, it's how children learn, it's how our brains work. We can't know everything about the world, and so our brains lump things into categories. And if those categories are accurate, then that's a useful process. But if the categories are inaccurate, then that can be unhelpful or even harmful. We all live in a society, and many of us study disciplines that were fundamentally shaped by the history of slavery and colonialism. As a result, historical assumptions about racial difference or hierarchy of civilizations historically shaped our disciplines and in some cases persists in many ways. For example, Africa was once relegated to being a dark continent outside of history, despite the fact that the earliest and longest-lived civilizations, writing, agriculture, urbanism, all developed independently in Africa, not to mention the human species, of which there is only one race. Happily, the idea of Africa as populated by warlike, barbarous, cannibalistic tribes is now widely considered to be part and parcel of what we refer to as pseudo-scientific racism, and it has been relegated, quite rightly, to the trash can of history. That is the result of intellectual debate. We get rid of these older assumptions. But decolonizing the curriculum isn't just about what we teach, it's about how we teach. Traditional assessment methods were hierarchical and exclusive, designed to weed out the wrong sort of student, a sort of academic survival of the fittest that, in fact, privileged the privileged, who had been taught how to do well on the assessments. And today's attainment gaps attest to the continued disadvantages faced by socially and neurologically diverse students. So decolonization promotes inclusive pedagogical practices that benefit everyone, seeking to make sure that the mark a student receives is an accurate reflection of how hard they've worked, how much they've learned, and their intellectual merit, not how expensive their education was. And in my experience, the main opposition to adopting inclusive pedagogical practices comes from, shall we say, older colleagues who frankly don't want to change the way they've always done things. Much of the debate about decolonization has sadly devolved into clickbait and fear-mongering. Single examples, such as the widely discussed example of a lecturer who put a trigger warning on Chaucer, are blown out of proportion and held up as heralds of sector-wide decline. If I were to add a trigger warning to Chaucer, it would be to warn students that Chaucer is not, in fact, the most representative example of Middle English vernacular. In fact, he spoke a dialect very specific to London, and his subsequent elevation to representative status is yet another example of Southern bias against Northerners. A much more representative example would be Gawain and the Green Knight, or The Poet's Underwork, Pearl, both translated and edited by the renowned woke scholar J.R.R. Tolkien. The point here is that debates about decolonization are often centered around people such as Chaucer, whose right to be at the center of the canon is presented uncritically. And these debates are a straw man, because decolonization is not and never has been about banning books or topics. Reports that SOAS students called for the removal of white philosophers such as Plato and Kant were disproven. Instead, the goal of decolonization is simply to expand the conversation in a way that is connected, additive, comparative. Opponents often claim that decolonization will lead to the end of the study of classics, ancient and medieval history. At my institution, the opposite has been true. In 2020, we introduced 5 new interdisciplinary decolonized modules, including global ancient history and global medieval history. At a time when many feared ancient history and classics would be cut, and indeed they have been cut at many institutions, and our MA program has been cut, the Global Ancient History module regularly enrolls over 120 students, which is 4 times the intake of classics and ancient history combined. Clearly, the ancient history is expanded to more than just Greece and Rome. Students across the faculty flocked to sign up. Likewise, the Global Middle Ages enrolled over 160 students. Neither of these modules are required. They're not even recommended options on any of the programs. Likewise, the slavery module, which, by the way, begins with a reading of Aristotle, is just as popular, showing a huge student demand. Furthermore, far from being political wokeism outside of the mainstream of the academy, many of the ideas embraced by decolonizing the curriculum are widely accepted by scholars. For example, slavery and colonialism were bad for the countries that were enslaved and colonized. It may be hard to see today, these were once considered ideas outside of the mainstream. If you all have not read Walter Rodney's How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, I would highly recommend it. As a scholar, he has the distinction of being the only historian I know to have been assassinated in a car bomb for his radicalism. You may be surprised then to learn that much of the work in the recent decades supporting his analysis is done by the new institutional economics school, whose luminaries, Acemoglu, Robinson, Johnson, just won the Nobel Prize in economics. Far from being outside of the mainstream, these arguments are the very definition of mainstream academia. The fact that a Marxist and a neoclassical economist, some say neoliberal school of economics agree shows that this is based on evidence, not politics, which is exactly how it should be. Widening the conversation is nothing new. And it's not just about people of color. We have already seen this with including women in the academy, including working class people in the academy. The curriculum has always been dominated by people of privilege, whether because they could write or because they had power. And the curriculum has always been revised to include new historical actors. I would put to you that it is the opposition who seeks to censor the curriculum. If it seems ironic that the side who espouses free speech tries to limit it, it's not surprising, because colonialism was always fundamentally anti-democratic. Reforming the curriculum to accurately reflect the diversity of history and society is the embodiment of democratic liberal values. That's why decolonization is not only necessary, but inevitable. One more sentence, please. To future generations, opponents of decolonizing the curriculum will look like the backward, knuckle-dragging opponents of admitting women and poor people to universities, fun to immortalize in a Julian Fellows period drama, but happily no part of the modern world.
Please go now invite Professor Ian Pacey to begin the case of the opposition.
Thank you. To avoid confusion, I'd like to begin by mentioning some educational practices I strongly support. Do I think it's worthwhile to study culture and thought from all parts of the world? Yes, absolutely. I also believe we should study multiple histories and their interactions, and concepts such as capital as a global phenomenon. The effects of colonialism upon all such phenomena are obviously important, though their existence, nature, and extent needs to be investigated anew for each specific case. Colonialism has been a global phenomenon for many centuries, and there's no less reason to study the impact of the Umayyad, Ottoman, Mughal or Qing empires, or for earlier times those of the Aztecs, Incas or Ghanaians, than those of Britain, France, the Netherlands, Spain and Portugal, especially with respect to contemporary concentrations of power, territory and culture. But what has brought about the alleged need to decolonize the curriculum, and what would it mean to do so? Standard definitions of colonize refer to one group taking over control of another land, people or sometimes culture. In the case of the curriculum in Western countries, and I want to focus my discussion on these, especially on higher education, in disputed territories within nation states, such as Catalonia, the Basque Country and Northern Ireland, some there might claim their education system has been colonised by dominant groups. But otherwise, in Western nations, state education is ultimately democratically accountable to the people as a whole. So what it means for such a curricula to be colonised is far from clear. Perhaps it could refer to characterizations established during colonial eras of non-Western peoples and regions. From a realist perspective, this is a legitimate objection, and warrants the injection of alternative data and perspectives as well. Or it could mean teaching the findings of the luminous amounts of scholarship on the history of colonialism. That's certainly something I would support, for scholarship that's nuanced, rigorous and evidence-based. But I do not believe that the movement to decolonise the curriculum... Yes?
So, to be clear, you are in favour of the policies of decolonizing curriculum, you just don't like calling it decolonizing curriculum.
I wouldn't call what I'm in favour of, I wouldn't call that at all. I'll come back to that. I don't believe the movement, as Lisa presented by many of its advocates, is really about such things. One of the most prominent books on the subject, Decolonising the University, edited by a team headed by sociologist Gominda K. Pambra, the sheer negativity of contributors towards ideas of objective knowledge, liberalism, enlightenment, or even civilized exchange is startling and alarming. It's difficult to know what would remain in education if all these were jettisoned. But in chapters in the same book by geographer Angela Last and educationalist Carol Azuma Dennis, the real Leninist agenda becomes clear. How to shamelessly exploit universities and their internationalization strategies, which, quote, can operate to the benefit of decolonial activists when they, quote, hit an obstacle in their immediate environment. And then more widely use the institutions to create an education, quote, that makes use of the language, time and authorial voice provided by the university to accomplish its purposes. This supplanting of education by activism is a flagrant abuse of the power and responsibility invested in academic staff, who should be able to listen to and engage with students of all. Now, I'm not giving away again, all opinions. Classical decolonial theories, such as those of Franz Fanon or Annibal Cazano, claim coloniality frames all aspects of knowledge and existence, but apply this crudely to a supposedly homogeneous West. In many institution statements on decolonisation, one encounters correspondingly crude views of the West versus the rest, as if the West were the only part of the world to have engaged in colonial conquest, and all regions therein had done so consistently throughout their history, whereas the rest is no less homogenised. This view is so simplistic as to be risible. For example, moving to my own field, a large part of the standard classical musical repertoire from the 18th and early 19th centuries comes from German or Italian lands. Neither region, nor many of its citizens, had any sizable part in extra-European colonialism prior to this time. Certainly not in the eras of Bach, Mozart, Beethoven, Schumann, Rossini, or for most of the life of Verdi, who lived in areas then under Austrian control. Yet it is common to simply label all of these as colonial music, rendering the term quite meaningless. It appears that anyone who can be classified as white is thus rendered colonial.
On.
Okay, very quickly.
Simple question, yes or no. Do you think Rhodes ought to have fallen?
What Rhodes ought to have fallen? That's not relevant here. Now, if this is really about racial binaries rather than colonialism, then its protagonist should have the honesty to say that. Then the associated stereotypes of supposed Western reason against supposed non-Western irrationality, knowledge and theory against intuition and fact and so on, will be clearer for all to see, and for that matter their own colonial provenance. In another article, Rowena Arshad says that existing understandings of the world, quote, have been grounded in cultural worldviews that have either ignored or been antagonistic to knowledge systems that sit outside those of the colonisers. This erases many Western thinkers who have engaged with thought, culture or social organisation from Asia, Africa and Latin America. And nowhere is this worse than in rhetoric about decolonising science and maths. The mathematician John Armstrong has noted how many papers on this cite key decolonial thinkers to claim that rationality, abstraction, progress and more are exclusive to the West. Cazano speaks of the European paradigm of rational knowledge and serve as strategies for domination. And this again ignores the huge contributions to the mathematical discipline from figures from India, Egypt, Korea, Belize, the Mayan people of Central America and beyond. Alan Sokal has noted how some decolonial thought made into official policy in New Zealand serves to relativise scientific truth out of existence. And Russian-American chemist Anna Krylov has linked attempts in the Soviet Union to purify science of Western influences with recent attempts to decolonise science. An example she gives is the removal at Sheffield University of Isaac Newton or Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz from an engineering curriculum because they could be considered as benefiting from colonial era activity. Whether they do or not tells us nothing about the scientific value of their work, which is what matters. But much decolonisation sacrifices science, scholarship and truth to ideology, no, as much as did the Soviets. Should Korean academics reject all Japanese scholarship? Or those in countries from Iran to Indonesia decolonise themselves of all Arab achievements, not least in mathematics? There's no point in enforcing curricular development as students stay away. Since the birth of the decolonised movement, there's little evidence of growth of, no, I'm not giving away again, of large new cohorts with degrees in Asian philosophies, South American native art traditions, African oral and written history, or especially study of non-Western languages and literary traditions. It would be fantastic to find more students reading The Tale of Genji, or Dream of the Red Chamber, or studying Ethiopian music. But these are highly demanding subjects for Western students, not least because of unfamiliarity of context, and require as sustained study as do Western traditions. Each may attract a small number of very dedicated students, but some may prefer actually to study such things in their country of origin. So what replaces reviled Western traditions? I've seen what's happened in my original discipline of music. Across the sector, attacks on Western classical traditions outweigh serious advocacy of study of non-Western ones. The one department dedicated to non-Western music, SOAS, cannot sustain an undergraduate music degree. They've had to close that. Elsewhere, decolonisation has been eschewal of music history, theory, analysis, notation in favour of vocational courses in music technology and musical theatre, or practical study of recent, mostly Anglo-American popular music, viewed by some, including at my own institution, as black music in comparison to white classical. The internationalism of high culture is replaced by the real provincialism of the popular culture of the English-speaking world, the real colonising force in my opinion. Scholarly investigation is replaced by platitudes on social justice. In many arts and humanities, dumbing down is legitimised by the language of the decolonial. Familiar and unchallenging culture and thought are taught in an enabling inclusivity, flattering students of what they already know. And some teaching in Russell Group departments may not see the extent of this in the rest of the sector. Critical investigation of colonialism, knowledge and culture is always worthwhile, as is wider global engagement. But to decolonise the curriculum has become a slogan devoid of much positive meaning or utility. It is about replacing exploration, rigour, evidence and critical thought with didactic politics of resentment, virtue signalling and post-colonial guilt, throwing into question the very meaning of education. And with all of that in mind, I urge you strongly to vote against the motion. And I'll give way because I have 45 minutes.
Am I allowed to ask a question?
Protect your time.
Okay, yes.
Thank you, Professor Case. Please could I now invite Mr. Charles Aldous to continue the case for the proposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Congratulations on a good term so far. Chaucer, drops. Churchill, let's forget about him. Communism implemented. If like our secretary Ollie, you read the Daily Mail, you will like this description of decolonisation. But, well, I should actually say some see it as woke tosh and a waste of money, which is only worthy of the people in Durham House. For those who don't know Durham House, the students' union. However, I believe this is a fundamental mischaracterisation of decolonisation. So let's start with a big question. What do Dan Lonsdale and I have in common? Well, we're both presidents. I'm a president-elect of the best student debating society in the United Kingdom. He is the president of the most unpopular students' union in England. We have some differences, however. He has a big beard like Lenin, whereas I struggle to grow a tail. For members of the House, the answer is that both Dan and I support decolonising the curriculum for various reasons. In the next 7 minutes, I am going to convince this House that decolonisation is about more, that it's just about more than decolonising in the sense of the term, but it's about adding different perspectives to history rather than erasing them. There's nothing to worry about. I may not agree with Comrade Dan on many things, but on decolonisation we stand together. With case studies ranging from Egypt to Norfolk, I will show you that if we take decolonisation and expand itself, going beyond Western colonialism, we can incorporate the views of ordinary people and, as my honourable comrade said, examine new source material. So firstly, decolonisation actually has grounds in history, meaning that it's not actually that radical. Let's look at the Victorian historian Lord McIlroy, who wrote in the 1840s, that even before, that was even before you were born, Jay. History's purpose is to expand evidence. It is the formation of the mind, the eager appetite for knowledge. Nothing radical with that. And I believe that decolonisation is actually the process of this appetite for knowledge. We're not upending past historiography, but merely expanding upon it. So now let us look at some case studies that prove why an expanded understanding of history that is beneficial is actually needed. As a young farmer, I struggled to get my maths GCSE. But I was more shocked in passing, eventually, that in schools throughout England, children are still not taught about the history of farming. While Turnip Townsend's crop rotation was important in the 17th century, we should learn more about where farming began. My farm, as Henry will know, was a rather leaky grain storage. But do you know that domesticated grain was found in 5,200 BC in Egypt, storage pits? Do you know that ancient Egyptians were the first people to grow arable crops on fertile delta of the Nile? This history is hardly taught in British schools, but I believe that it is a mistake, because we are not, as Macaulay said and wrote about, expanding our knowledge. So what does decolonisation then look like in relation to farming? Well, I thought about this earlier, and actually I came up with an answer, and I proposed to the House that we had Caleb Cooper and Jeremy Clarkson set the national farming curriculum, decolonising and exploring uncontested and untouched aspects of history. Now at this point, you probably think that I'm mad, that the pre-event dinner wine is a bit too good.
Only one glass of us.
Only one. Actually, I'm a bit of a lightweight. But now let's turn to Norwich. Most people know this city as the home of Ed Balls, Alan Partridge, and one of England's best football clubs, Norwich City. Though very few students have talked about its rich culture and impact on the early modern economy. Letters and records from the early modern period, show that 30% of people in Norwich spoke Dutch and French during the 1970s. The strangers, the Dutch and French people who came to Norwich in 1565, revitalised Norwich's wool trading economy, cementing Norwich as England's second city. Profits taken from this economy were donated to constructing churches, and there is evidence to say that Norwich wool trading went into the foundation of banks such as Barclays and insurance conglomerates such as Aviva. Even Norwich's mascot, the canary, is named after the bird that the strangers introduced to Norwich. Members of the House, why is studying Norwich an example of decolonising and crucially expanding the curriculum? Well, much like farming, even students in my local primary school, Charles Darwin on Rose Lane, have never heard of this rich culture and history. So through studying Norwich's history, we can maybe, just maybe, disprove the notion that all Norwich folk have 6 fingers and our mums also are China. Seems a big jump, but when I speak of this country, most people in Britain think of it as the home of apple factories, noodles, Jeremy, and Target and Trump's trade. Again, this is where our curriculum really does miss the point, and it should be developed to acknowledge an underappreciated, highly valuable country. From the 13 Chinese dynasties to the Opium Wars and the Communist Revolution, there is a litany of source material that's hardly touched upon in British schools. I am actually a living testament to this point, because the first exposure I got to a Chinese history was in the first year at 5 PM on a cold, dark Friday afternoon in Elbert Riverside. Frankly, that's not good enough. And clearly, fellow members, we can do better. And that is why we need to decolonise the curriculum and actually look more at countries like China. So instead of being president, and as a citizen of Shanghai, I propose that Jerry Mead is best placed to lead this charge. And that's why he should be made Education Secretary. So to conclude, I've given you 3 examples of where we can expand our understanding as part of decolonisation and look at traditionally overlooked source material. This is fundamentally not a radical left-wing agenda, because otherwise I wouldn't be here. It's not about cancelling Chaucer and removing Churchill. The proposition, us, although we're on the opposition side, should not be in the Sun or Mail front page tomorrow morning. Instead, we are moderate, and we are here today to show you that actually this is a moderate, well-balanced academic ideology. And so therefore, I implore you all, fellow members, to back the proposition. Thank you.
I'm afraid, Sakir hasn't offered me a peerage yet, so I can't quite do I now ask Professor Lawrence Goldman to continue the case for the opposition?
Thank you very much indeed. I often feel when I take to my feet that the opposition has made my case for me, and I'll begin with such an example. Mr. Aldous here was regaling you with quotes from Lord Macaulay. Thomas Babington Macaulay was an MP and statesman and son of a very great anti-slavery activist. He was sent to India for 4 years in the 1830s, Mr. Aldous, where he wrote a famous minute on Indian education, in which he determined, and the British government followed his advice, that all Indians henceforth should be taught in English, which is what they are taught to this very day. Now there's a brilliant example of a colonialist indeed improving the lives of hundreds of millions of Indians, because their great advantage in the world today is that their lingua franca is English, and they are able therefore to take their part in the modern world far more successfully. No point of order, you come from Pakistan, you told me that over dinner. Okay. Now, it's a great pleasure to be here tonight. Thank you for inviting me. In truth, I think I'd be much happier in the pub, holding a kind of pub argument. And you'll know the rules of a pub argument, which is the first person to mention Hitler and the Nazis in a pub argument loses immediately. End of. But I want to start with the Nazis rather than end. I want everyone to hear to summon up a famous image which you've seen in your minds, you've got it, the ritual burning of books. It was carried out in Berlin on May the 10th, 1933. Joseph Goebbels, Nazi Minister for Propaganda, was in the chair, as it were. One after another, members of the Hitler Youth and the Sturmabteilung threw armfuls of books into the blaze. And of course, they included Jewish authors, founders of modernity, like Marx, like Freud, like Kafka and Einstein. No, absolutely not. You'll hear me out for a while. But they also included great German authors, like Thomas Mann, like Hermann Hesse, like Bertolt Brecht, socialists, satirists, humorists, serious novelists. Now, I can see what you're all thinking. Where are we going? What's this got to do with decolonising the curriculum? The answer is everything. Because books burned in Berlin were destroyed because of the identity of their authors, and because their ideas, of course, were countered by Nazi ideology. And we are here tonight to debate the impact of an ideology, anti-colonialism, on what we teach and learn in universities. We also inevitably are discussing identity and racism. It's the principle of decolonising what we think and read, that the works of white, Western and usually male authors should be replaced by something else written by someone else. Now, you'll protest, and I can see that we have a gentleman here who enjoys protesting, and I have no time for it. But those in favour of decolonisation are as much enthralled to an ideology as those young Nazis in Berlin in 1933. It's a different ideology, for sure. But it's still a way of framing a world, seeing what you want to see in it, rather than seeing reality. Now, perhaps some of you here tonight really do want to remove the work of white European and North American scholars simply because they are what they are. Now, if that is the case, if you really wish to cancel and silence people because they don't fit a certain worldview, nothing could be more intolerant. Nothing could be a greater betrayal of the idea of a university, whatever the subject you're studying. Of course, overhauling reading lists and changing one's mind are intrinsic to a university education. You should be suspicious of anyone, any lecturer, who doesn't adapt their syllabus and their bibliography as new work is published in the field. But those changes to the curriculum are wholly good because they're driven by ideas, by evidence and research. It was John Maynard Keynes, the great economist, who famously said, "When the facts change, I change my mind." What do you do, sir?
Point.
Yes.
You made a fantastic rebuttal to a case we have not made. I beg for meaningful engagement. Do you think, in any sort of good faith world, we are burning calculus and not teaching first-year math students about Newton or Leibniz or Hamilton? What is this world you are building? It is a fantasy.
But it all depends upon an ideology, my friend. They burnt books in Berlin. Right, thank you. Moreover, why design a curriculum which is not rigorously focused on the very best that has been thought and said in that very famous phrase? Set out to decolonise the curriculum and thus include in it works chosen not on their merits, but because they advance the right opinions or are written by people with a specific identity, and you condemn yourselves to an education based not on the best, but on the politically acceptable, or indeed the second class. And to pick up Professor Mobley's point, anyone in this room who honestly believes that Gawain and the Green Knight are in any way comparable in terms of their literary merit to the greatest poet in the English language, it might have been the dialect that he wrote in, but the author of the Canterbury Tales, Troilus and Cressade, the Parliament of Fowls, anyone who thinks that needs to take an English O-level, as I once did. Now, I'm puzzled, as do many here this evening, over the meaning of decolonisation in this context. To decolonise the curriculum surely implies that someone, somewhere, at some stage, has colonised it. But when, and with what, and to what end? Because the curriculum you study, all of you, sciences or arts, is the work of ages, the work of centuries. When Durham was founded in that great year, when Grey was Prime Minister and about to abolish slavery in 1832, when Durham was founded, students who came here studied only mathematics, classical languages, or theology. Now, stop for a minute and think of the proliferation of subjects that you here tonight all study. Social, artistic, technological, scientific thought, which has freely developed, unconstrained. You cannot decolonise your curriculum because no one colonised it in the first place. No one conquered it, planted a flag, claimed it for an empire. It developed by topsy. Thanks to the development of ideas, it has an intellectual core which has developed, and if you want, as it were, multifaceted education, you are part of it. That is the way education at higher levels has developed. Yes, go for it.
Murasaki Shikibu wrote The Tale of Genji, the very first novel, the very first modern novel, centuries before Don Quixote was written. Most people in
irrelevant, utterly irrelevant. I have nothing, I've said nothing at all to do with that. Quiet, back to your boxer. Consider the problem from another perspective. Be utilitarian for a moment. Your first interview for a job after you've graduated. It's coming, it's coming. Now your boss will want you to give of your best in providing the best service possible for customers and clients. But if you tell the boss that in the name of decolonisation you didn't read the great authors, you didn't read Chaucer, but you read Gawain and the Green Knight, for example. But instead of studying the Reformation of the 16th century or the French Revolution. You looked at the history of some obscure region which had no impact on the development of modern history. Or if, for example, you chose the geography of Pacific atolls over the geography of Western Europe. If you didn't choose the best and the most relevant, what do you think your boss would decide? Maybe you aren't the person to deal in the best way, in the best manner, with the clients and the customers required. Now, we could think a little bit about how we've got here. How is it that a great university, such as Durham, has put together a debate tonight on such a pernicious idea that the curriculum should be determined by a controversial and contested ideology? I think it's a pathology that we're dealing with, a distortion of the university's ideal, the academic mind, and the history of higher education in this country. You are part of that history. Maintain that wonderful tradition. Do not destroy it. Thank you.
Shahzen, how's going to do with it? Yes. Thank you, Professor Durham. Thank you, Professor Durham. Sorry, yes. Now I would like to invite Shahzen to conclude the case. It seems that he's very keen to speak.
Wonderful. Wish my president to begin? Okay. नहीं है तेरा नशेबंद कसरे सुल्तानी की गुंबद पर, तू शाही है बसेरा कर पहाड़ों के चट्टानों पर. For those of you not familiar with Urdu or Farsi, that roughly translates: it is not your place to be satisfied atop the minarets of the greatest palace. You are a king among kings. You build your empire atop the peaks of the highest mountains this planet has to offer. When Iqbal writes about me, I'm a king, I'm a falcon soaring over the skies. When Kipling writes about me, I'm a dog, I am half animal, I am closer proximity to Bagheera and to Baloo than I am to a human being. I think that that side of the house fundamentally refuses to acknowledge the pernicious nature of colonial authors when talking about the colonial subjects. There is a dynamic of master onto subject, of master onto slave, that they refuse to engage with. Never more ashamed to be in this house. Tragedy is coming at the whip. Right? A few things I'll be doing in this debate. 3 sentences on the page because I told everyone at the dinner that an actual debate is better than a union debate. I'll show you why. No need to write in advance. First then, what is decolonization? I'll bring up the points my 2 former speakers brought. I'll tell you how they refuse to give you any meaningful content. Second, how is this bad for the individual? What is the disenfranchisement? What is the build-up of false consciousness? How do you interact with the world fundamentally against you? Third, how does this hurt educational and epistemic injustice, or if you would rather, the stories left untold? Never prouder to propose. First then, what is decolonizing the curriculum? I think just like on a general strategic level, just like in like the rules of a debate, the government side generally has the fiat to say their motion. So even if what we say is in the tightest spirit of what this debate is, which I will justify as I go on, even if we aren't arguing in the broadest spirit, it is on the burden of the opposition to engage with the debate set up by the government. Purely strategically, they lose, they do not argue meaningfully. But then, let's actually tell you what we told you decolonization is. What does it look like? Broadly, it looks like a pluralism of opinions. It looks like the expansion of those narratives systematically excluded from curricula because they were seen to be, because they are presumed to have been penned by barbarians or to intellectual fools. What do I mean by this? I mean the interaction with people like Iqbal. I mean the interaction with people like Murasaki Shikibu. If I was allowed to complete my point, I would tell you how like the honorable deputy leader of opposition was misleading you. When I talked about Murasaki Shikibu penning the first modern novel 600 years before Don Quixote was written, and still most people in this country believe Don Quixote is the first novel. That is an instance of the colonial mindset ripping away credit from those who meritocracy deserve it. It is accreditation. No, thank you. It is accreditation. It is accreditation to those individuals who benefit from the color of their skin or their proximity to the socio-economic elite. Never prouder. What then do we actually offer you here? We say a few things. We say first, no, this is the broadest modeling you got from my two earlier speeches. First, it is expansion. So in decolonization, the vast majority of instances is not about exclusion, it is about adding in new ideas. That is to say, look at the content we have taught for the last 150, 200 years, place it in the context of contemporaries from other parts of the world. This is teaching you about history penned during the Mughal dynasty. This is teaching you about historiography from people who were in the Umayyads or the Abbasids alongside the English and the French and the Germans. But even in the instance that like things are removed from the content, as they are so eager to talk to you about, let's talk about what is removed. Do I think it is going to be Isaac Newton's books being burned? No! I'm a math student. I promise I am studying calculus. I don't understand these absurd ideas. What is removed under decolonization? It is the removal of things like eugenics and phrenology from general biological discourse. Those are the ideas being removed. I am perfectly fine to say, I don't think it is okay for them to vilify me for saying I don't want to learn like some pseudobiology that tells me I am closer to a monkey than I am to a human. I'll take a point.
Do you think literature can be taught well in translation? I mean, you wouldn't usually study Dostoevsky in an English course.
Well,
if we were
yes.
to read Tenchi,
Yes, I do.
10th century Japanese.
Okay, awesome.
I mentioned that, which you're saying.
Awesome. A few things. Firstly, yes, I think there is value to translate. I think just a priori, I think you if you restrict yourself strictly to linguistic grounds of the language you're most familiar with, particularly in a world where most people only speak one language, you restrict the intellectual bounds you can interact with. I just don't think that's very good. I'll engage in good faith because I actually know how to work. I'm not a union speaker, right? Sorry. Right? Engaging in good faith. Do I think that when you translate there is a difference? Yes, of course. I think you are not solely reading the pen of the author, you're reading the pen of the translator in that instance. I don't think that's fundamentally bad. I think especially then, because it's not just about what you actively engage with, it's about the credit, it's about the meaning of who you consider intellectually elite, intellectually powerful versus intellectually diminished. I think what I'm not saying is that every English literature course at university must be teaching you the 6,000 pages of Murasaki Shikibu. But I think Murasaki deserves the right to be told as one of the greatest authors to live in the last 2,000 years for creating a new medium that credit should not go to Don Quixote. Bad point of information, right? Moving on then, under this framework of actually including new novel ideas, engaging with them in meaningful capacities, trying to dismantle the preconceived notions and the biases that we all come into based on our primary socialization, based on things we were taught in earlier forms of school, based on current existing curricula. That is what decolonization is. Is to have a hope of winning this debate, the whip must engage the model we set out to you. I told you that the deputy leader opposition was to give fine job of rebutting a case we did not give. That is not what this debate is about. Do not let them mislead you. Second then, how does this hurt the individual? I want to talk to you about this. Circle back to the opening of the speech. What does it mean when the only people who tell me I am powerful, tell me there is dignity in my personhood, tell me that I'm intelligent, that I belong amongst the top people who look like me? What does it mean when the people who are generally regarded as not to be the most prestigious, intellectual, the most prestigious academics, coming from second-rate or third-rate universities, are the only ones who talk about my dignity? Even if not explicitly, even if not intentionally, the message I see is that they are lying. The message I see is that anyone worth their salt at Oxford or Cambridge or Durham, anyone worth their salt at Harvard or the rest of the Ivy League, does not agree with them. I think you internalize these narratives. I think you set up this sense of false consciousness, this extremely pernicious voice in the back of your head that nags away at your sense of self. I think this is mental colonization in its truest form. I think that it's just a priori bad. Practical impacts then. What happens if you're deprived of your sense of self because you are buying into these narratives that take away your dignity and the capacity to self-actualize? How are you likely to behave? You are likely to then, when you see that intellectual spaces are dominated by the white male elite, by cisgender people, by people who do not always look like you or sound like you, or come from places you go to. When you see the people in your neighborhood are never going to university but they are all working at the corner store, then at the best they are earning £30,000 a year and never higher. Then if you want any hope, that is not what you hope for. You will only have your hopes dashed against the rocks. You lose your ambition. You are less likely to try or hope for a better future. You are less likely to push further. You are less likely to chase these avenues. You are less likely to pursue upper mobility because it is impossible. Because the only people who get there, people who are really intelligent, the people who are really revolutionary, do not look like you. We think that is bad. We think you remove the ability for self-actualization, a fundamental human right. Note, no points of information with the actual case I've given. I assume opposition agrees. On to them. Third point, how does this hurt education? I'll be directly contending with what I got from the deputy leader here. First, I want to talk about the stories left untold purely by this is assuming no ill will and no malice. That is to say, when people are systematically kept out of institutions of education, when the stories are left untold, when stories are likely to get told by the few people who break through these systematic barriers and get to the top. They are less likely to share meaningful accounts of their history because it is less palatable. You need a change, you need a surge of momentum in order to change established structure. I think that's just intuitively true, right? We think these stories you get about people are like to be tokenistic, like to be non-meaningful. You want to understand the nuances of what this engages with. I'll throw out an idea over here, and I strongly recommend everyone reads a book by Eduardo Benito Silva called Racism Without Racists. There's a very fascinating construct he talks about called white habitus. White habitus is the understanding of Caucasian people, but how they assume the world works and how the social structures that are catering to them work. There is a fundamental disconnect between when you see the police and you assume they're here to help you and not here to arrest you. You perceive the world and all its nuances in a different capacity. Stories are left untold. We think we think in this instance it's just an epistemic problem. We think it is bad when the information available is not information that is universal. We think it is bad when not all stories are told because learning isn't severely limited. By the analysis we get on meritocracy from deputy leader opposition, we should be salivating the demand for any form of pluralism. We should be trying to get the greatest diversity of opinion. We achieve that by actively pushing for it. What then have I shown to you in this debate? First, I gave you an actual model that has not been engaged with. I rebuilt what my two earlier speakers gave you. I told you why they've been engaging in bad faith and straw manning our actual case. I then give you a construction of the fundamental human dignity to pursue your self-actualization and how this kneecaps the already disenfranchised and fundamentally disadvantaged in society. That's bad. I then told you about the epistemic injustice and the stories that are left untold by people who are not allowed access into these ivory towers of intelligentsia. I tell you about the stories that are told are tokenistic and non-representative. I will have my time. I will not be silenced like my other people who are forced to be colonized and the mental colonization that takes place. Never promised me when it worked.
Yes, thank you, Shahzen, for a rather rousing speech. I now invite Mateusz to conclude the case for the opposition.
Well, I felt like the proposition lost when they said they have something in common with Daniel Lonsdale or the student union. But anyway, they continuously talk about expanding the curriculum, okay? But when people talk about decolonizing something, they claim it broadens the curriculum. And they claim it's about teaching history from a broader perspective, as each of them have said. This is a noble idea, but it's just that, an idea. One open to being exploited for ideological purposes which they continuously have been ignoring. For in practice, when we talk about decolonizing the curriculum, what do we mean? Well, this involves the whole historical narrative of the way things are taught. In a manner which obscures the past, both its villains and heroes. Take for example, the way we are taught about our very own institutions like Cambridge. Recently, the university set up an investigation called the Legacies of Enslavement Advisory Group. Now, I read Lawrence's essay on this, and I found it very good in my argument. But this involves exploring the university's colonial ties. Whilst, regrettably, there were individuals from the University of Cambridge who were educated there, who partook in the slave trade, the report itself admitted that there was no direct link of a slave plantation or enslaved people being linked to Cambridge. Instead, the article relies on guilt by association, because it cannot actually directly link ownership of the institution of Cambridge to slavery. And this is a result of the decolonization narrative. And yet, whilst there is a plethora of articles which criticise the roles of these previous graduates in the slave trade, there's relatively little reported, and even more which is hidden, of the noble graduates who tirelessly campaigned against it, which is quite ironic that the first speaker of the proposition said that decolonising the curriculum would highlight more of these people. Because when they have actually tried that, that didn't actually take place. So, I mean, you don't hear about Henry Colthurst or Thomas Clarkson and their efforts at campaigning against it. In fact, Clarkson was actually criticised by the group for being too elitist and too gradualist. So you see how they obscure our heroes of the past.
Where do you hear the name?
Thomas Clarkson. A second thing we ought to consider when we address this motion is why are we taught these things? Well, primarily for a subject like history, I'm going to focus on history as a historian, we are taught this by objective fact, and we
Take point in the meanwhile.
yeah,
Until the works of Sir Syed Ahmed Khan are normalized, Aligarh University will never get its rightful reputation back. Any academic from that institution is secondary to the academics from Oxford. Why do you have epistemic equality? Why do you fight the false consciousness and mental colonization? Engage with the case as I gave it.
well, no, but you also there's a lot of waffle and not a lot of substance. We have been continuously talking about learning more niche aspects of history. Stuff maybe about the farming, the second proposition the speaker brought up, about how it was developed in Africa and so on. But the thing is, what we are taught primarily in history, which might be seen as a colonial impact, is because primarily the countries which are colonial countries, like Britain, France, Germany, America to an extent with its neo-colonial empire, they have the most impact on our modern world and the modern world we live in.
No comments.
Because of that reason. And that is why we are taught those countries. So this idea that we should change our curriculum to include the mainstay of smaller countries, maybe like Lebanon or Ireland, although they may have rich national history, the fact is they're not very relevant in the modern formation of our global history and our current politics.
Is he trying?
No comments.
You can learn.
Yeah, it is relevant.
Yeah, it's not a lot. Anyway, no, because look at the Industrial Revolution though. Realistically, what had a bigger impact? The Industrial Revolution in our current modern society, or farming which was developed 5,000 years ago? I mean, Now thirdly, we must consider what is the actual purpose of this motion. What does it actually serve? Is it to help us understand our own history to a greater extent? Or is it a merely self-flagellating act of making us ashamed of our history? Something I understand why the honourable gentleman of the proposition may feel entitled to do so. Because of that shameful break. Anyway, the point being, I struggle to see what this proposition actually aims to achieve from this motion. This is a free country. If you so desire to study your more niche aspects of history, then you can do so. You have the ability to do so. There are plenty of models which are already open to you. This movement of decolonisation is frankly unnecessary. Academia does not stop you from what we learn. I know for sure when it comes to my own studies, I'm spoiled for choice of the different views when it comes to issues of empire and roles of the European powers within the world. So, to sum up our argument and our rebuttals to the proposition, what are they actually saying? Well, they're saying, okay, decolonisation is an expansion of the curriculum. Our curriculum simply does not have the space to include less relevant things towards global narrative. Frankly, it's the norm across the world that you are taught primarily your own history or the history of your histories of other countries which have significantly impacted your own country. A second point is there are harmful consequences for this motion. For this is fundamentally an ideological movement. And as we've seen in history, whenever ideologies try and go into the objective study of certain topics, it always leads to ill. It always leads to stifled intellectual growth. It leads to reduced academic debate, it leads to reduction in freedom of thought, and it frankly leads to self-censorship, as we have seen in recent topics like Israel-Palestine. Frankly, if you just include all of these different manners of debate, you're self-censoring yourself, and it's a Pandora's box which could lead us onto the dark road of American polarization. And I'm sure none of us would like to be like the Americans. And thirdly, how are we actually going to implement this? Like, the opposition keeps talking about, okay, we're going to expand these things, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. But it's not a tangible motion, okay? You already have the opportunity to learn other aspects of history. But if you're trying to decolonize, say, something like the national curriculum, you can't. Just because things like history is such a broad topic, how are you going to include new things when there's already 1,000 years of English history which you have to study? It's frankly impossible to include the history of this country over there just because my granddad's from there, or the history of this country over there just because my friend's cousin's there. You can't. You can do that at higher education, and that is a wonderful thing about the country we live in, that our academics at universities like Durham, like Oxford, like Cambridge, you have so many options for these things. Yeah, go on.
I was for what you're saying, because this debate is about university level. Your arguments are self-defeating. You can study at your own time. You can study your own models at your own time. The arguments are cyclical. Engage with the case as we give.
I disagree, because a proposition, by fundamentally being a proposition, you're proposing a change to something, correct?
Yeah.
So what are you proposing to change right now? You already have the option to learn these different perspectives of history. You do. And there's nothing which is stopping you from learning about this. There's nothing which is stopping you from learning about your own biases, comparing historians. Our marking theories for stuff like the humanities subjects addresses these things. They address these contexts. They address biases which are present within them. There is not because of decolonisation, because it's a fundamentally responsibility of any academic field, regardless of political leanings, to look at your sources, check the biases behind those sources, see how that impacts the discourse, and so on. So, why are we rejecting this motion? They are talking about an expansion of the field. But what are they expanding to? There is nothing tangible offered by them. There is a lot of emotions, there is a lot of weird analogies, but there is nothing actually tangible to understand. On the other hand, our great country... Okay, fine. To sum up, it's impossible. What they're asking for is already granted, so there's no need to decolonise the curriculum. It's merely an ideological tool to impact and stifle academic debate.
Thank you, Aldous. Yes, I would take this opportunity to remind both sides of the House that it is important that your behaviour remains civil on the floor, and you respect the person who is on the dispatch front. Could I now ask for 4 speeches? Any speeches? I'm sure you will. Yes, any points from the floor? Please state your name and college. And yes, Hugo.
Are we doing 4 speeches?
Yeah.
I wasn't going to speak tonight, otherwise I would have come in a nice suit and shaved, but my conscience is always captive to the truth. The main thing I really want to rebut, I don't think was really rebutted by this side, but really kind of came out of the opposition, is this idea that these people are the side of truth, and then this side is the side of ideology. I need to recharacterize this and say, no, we both have ideology. Fundamentally, there is ideology in the status quo. For somebody who really likes to promote European ideas, please read your Kantian philosophy, right? There is the noumena, there is the phenomena. We require ideological structures in order to interpret everything. So we both have ideology. In fact, when you say you have no ideology, this is the highest form of ideology, right? And certain assumptions that you make really, really show this. When you said that, when you go to a job interview, you won't be able to talk about the Reformation. Why is the Reformation relevant? Why is the Reformation in fact, why is it more relevant than the Sunni-Shia split, which actually has profound effects in today's world? Your assumption that irrelevant European medieval history is more relevant than actual impactful Arab medieval history is that ideology right there. But also, the ideology is often implicit and we don't even notice it. When you learn about evolution in biology, you get a nice little biographical sketch about Charles Darwin, and he lived in Shropshire, and he went to Shrewsbury School, or for the posh among you, Shrewsbury School. But when you learn algebra, you don't know that it's algebra. You don't learn that it was created by Al-Khwarizmi. That's the implicit ideology right there. It's right underneath your eyes. So both sides' ideology, the question is, which ideology do you want? Do you want the ideology of colonialism, or do you want the ideology of justice? And then the last thing I wanted to say, an absolutely interesting POI came from you, where you said, there might be translational issues. There's going to be translational issues. I think, quite frankly, we've all been very, very impacted in profound ways by a big old book that was written in Hebrew, Greek, and Aramaic. And I don't think we had any problems with that, so I don't think Sanskrit would be too much for us to manage.
Thank you, Hugo. Do we have any more floor speeches? Sebastian.
Thank you. I do not believe we should decolonise our curriculum, for it already is decolonised. For example, my lecture for... Sorry. any closer and you'll start guessing, okay? So, my lecturer for international political economy is one of the most woke women I have known. You have Lenin, you have Marx, and I think people who are with me can relate. And obviously, I don't think we should decolonise our curriculum because Western values are better. But no, I think Western values are superior in this aspect. An independent judiciary, democracy, family values. And obviously the Greeks invented democracy, but the British Empire spread it. So, am I right? He talks about the 1832 emancipation.
This is why Dan Johnson is the one
My right honourable, I'll deal with you later, don't you worry.
No respect for the one who said the British Empire was
It was great. Now we'll get on to that. My right honourable friend, very nice lad, he talks about the 1832 Abolition of Slavery Act. Now yes, we did have abolition of slavery, 30% of the entire British budget. But no, it goes further. The Home Secretary, Lord Liverpool, was the first ever figure in history to actually reprimand countries for having slavery.
Found the transatlantic
You'll see later, don't you worry.
Thank you.
And, what else? I don't know. Yeah, okay, that's it. Thank you very much.
Refusal to engage in society that supports colonial structures, principles, walk-out, and vote. I urge anyone with a sense of conscience or justice to refuse to engage in society that says that society that established transatlantic slave trade, the society that spreads democracy.
The society endorses no side of the debate, but the society will allow people to speak at the dispatch box. Thank you. Have a good evening. Sorry, I'm just very sorry for this. Yes, so the society is impartial, officially, on any debate, and I would really just like to stress that point. No member of society speaking at the dispatch box represents the society. They speak at the dispatch box, they speak on their personal capacity and their personal opinions. Thank you. Could we... a little later. Could we now invite questions from the floor? For either side, please state your name and college and which side you address your questions to. Chap on the left of the front row.
Yeah, hi, Asa Cohen, collegeist at Hilton B. Sorry, Asa Cohen, collegeist at Hilton B. My question is addressed to the proposition. I would ask it to the honourable member who has now departed the room. However, I'm going to have to ask it to the remaining two of you. Bearing in mind every country, or almost every country, in the modern world today has at some point been colonised, how can you say that we as a country should be doing this and should be decolonising our curriculum whilst no other countries are doing this at the moment, at this point in time? Thank you.
This is a transatlantic movement. It's South Africa, the United States, France. I'm happy to tell you that there are many countries that are going through this process. First and foremost, the countries who were themselves colonized. This is by no means something that is particularly an attack on the British or the British Empire, although I know that if you are British, it must feel that way. But this isn't a movement that started in this country. It's not a movement particularly attacking this country in particular. This is a much broader intellectual movement that goes back decades. Ngugi wa Thiong'o's Decolonizing the Mind comes out of the 1970s, I think published in 1986. Roads Must Fall, all of the movements in the United States and France. So it's absolutely not just a movement that's focused here. I'm happy to clarify that.
Yes. Chapman back.
Christian Morris, University College. I'd just like to ask what colonialism has to do with the not teaching of farming more in schools.
I guess I'm best. As we've been saying throughout our speeches, this is more than just colonialism. This is about expanding the curriculum to other source material. For example, the Norwich Book of the Poor has been looked at by very few historians. The 31 letters from the Dutch remonstrangers between 1568 and 1570 to Ghent. But my friend, this is about expanding it. And yes, I accept the word decolonisation might have suggested 10 or 20 years ago it's about empire. But actually, as we've shown tonight, it's a lot more nuance to that, and a hell of a lot more modern.
Yes. Charles, on the point of Dutch, I would like to remind you that in 1688, England was colonised by the Dutch. Yes. And yes, any more points? Yes, agreed.
Just because decolonising the curriculum is necessarily relevant to subjects like music, doesn't necessarily mean it's not essential for subjects like international relations when we're talking about colonisation and independence specifically. How did the opposition respond to that?
You want to come back on that? Yes, good. Well, I can't imagine there's a single person working in international relations who doesn't think a wide variety of international perspectives is vitally important in order to do that. And I'm not convinced that there's much evidence that that's not the case. Anyhow, I don't think that's about decolonisation. It's a question of whether it's possible to arrive at some sort of scholarly knowledge, or whether all knowledge practically is going to be tainted and colonial almost by default, which is what a lot of the proponents of the decolonised movement are putting forward. And they're using what I would say is just a sort of collective ad hominem fallacy. They're just basing the view of the knowledge based on what the sort of demographic, what the ethnicity of the person saying it, not on its own internal coherence, not on its own appeal to rigour and evidence and things. I didn't quite hear what the first subject was that you said that it wasn't applicable to.
Well, you mentioned music.
Music,
So
yes.
it's
Well, it's certainly a big issue in music, and I'd just like to, if I could, just slightly add on one point, because I do think we are hearing a lot of perspectives from people in Russell Group universities and elite universities where the teaching of high-level subjects is probably not so much in doubt. For those of us working in the mid-ranking or other sector, it's a whole other question. So it's not about whether we teach Chaucer or whether we teach Gawain and the Green Knight. And I happen to personally prefer Gawain myself. I love Chaucer as well. It's about whether any teaching of any medieval literature is just a sort of elitist dead white European males, and that's what you'll be hearing in English departments outside of the upper layer. That's what you'll be hearing all the time. People trying to get rid of all of that and saying we should be reading comics instead.
More questions, please. The chap in the second row.
Forgive the yellow hair.
Name and college, please.
Nathaniel Labuma, South College. Just forgive the yellow hair. I've been getting looks. It's a charity. It was not by choice. So my question was directed to our good friend, who's, I don't know if he tried to lead an uprising against the union, but so he made one point in his argument which did irk me. And it contradicted, the proposition's main point, which was that decolonising the curriculum is ultimately to expand it. He said that we should remove ideas such as eugenics, but it was George Santayana who said those who forget the past are condemned to repeat it. So what I just wanted to, if he was here, it would be great to understand what he meant by removing ideas such as eugenics.
Yeah.
Maybe we should never know what he
So he was speaking from the perspective of a science student. I teach eugenics when I teach the history of science. Absolutely, I completely agree with you. We're going to understand how science is developed, how these categories and understandings and the historical movements, right, and the great injustices that come out of, the eugenics movement, which was widely accepted, for many, many years up until the Holocaust, really. But ideas out of the eugenics movement still pop up in the sciences because they're so embedded in these narratives. So I think he is speaking from the perspective of a math student, from a student who's taking science. Does he want to be taught this as fact in a biology textbook? No, absolutely not. The historians will take that on very happily and make sure that we're all aware of these pernicious, of this historical movement and of some of the ways in which it can survive today, including in fields like population genetics, human genetics, the ridiculous vitamin D deficiency research during COVID-19 that sort of made the UK the laughing stock of the world, right? And it's a great example of the way in which these things survive in science today. But I think the point there was, we should be learning about that in the humanities. And that's how we'll all, gain these critical skills that we need to be able to identify these things when they pop up. It's like that old New Yorker cartoon of, scientists can tell you how to clone a dinosaur. Historians will tell you why that's a really bad idea.
Thank you. No, I was supposed to be impartial, but I thought in Dawson there you should go and learn the history. But yes, any more questions, please? Chap at the back.
Tim Walton Home, John Snow College.
Sorry, do you mind saying that again?
Tim Walton Home, John Snow College.
Thank you very much.
The proposition, you continually mentioned the expansion of the curriculum to include new decolonised topics. What current material would you remove to make space?
So that's a really good question because in our case, actually, ancient and medieval history had already been removed from the curriculum. So I was bringing it back. So if I hadn't created the Global Ancient module, the Global Middle Ages module, our history students would not have the option of studying classical or medieval history. And this is what I mean. It is absolutely true that these subjects are in decline. They've been cut in many places. Student numbers are down, the programs have been cut, because students don't want to take these courses. They've learned about Rome and Greece from year 2, year 3, year 4 in school. For God's sake, stop fetishizing the Roman Empire. My 9-year-old is sick of Greece and Rome. But when you start bringing in Egypt and the Assyrian Empire and the Chinese Empire, we bring in India, we start talking comparatively, we start talking about trade connections, the spread of writing, the spread of farming. The world was much more connected. So we haven't had to cut anything. In fact, we brought these things back. So I would put to you that if we want to save some of these fundamental areas of study, we have to decolonize them. Because students are not signing up, and otherwise we will lose them. Thank you.
We're very fortunate in Durham to have a proper classics and medieval history department. We're very grateful for that. And I will say that next Friday, it will be a motion. The motion of the debate will be "This House regrets the fall of Rome," and does not want to decolonize the curriculum. Please do come for that. But anyway, yes. If you, the opposition, like to respond.
Very quick point. I mean, just to point Christine here. I mean, you want to teach people in opposition to colonialism, so do you not want them to learn about the Roman Empire and how it colonized large parts of Europe and North Africa?
Well, they do. It's not for me. I don't teach that part of the module.
Yes, well, I'm slightly surprised, actually, because you're supposed to be arguing for decolonisation, and it looks as if you're teaching your students recolonisation. The Assyrian Empire, the ancient Egyptian Empire, the Persian Empire. How many empires do you want to put in to an anti-imperial course that you're telling us you want to teach our students? What does decolonisation mean if you're teaching your students the history of empire? It happens not to be the British Empire, but you're enjoying teaching them and they're enjoying studying the history of all sorts of other empires. So I don't think you've decolonised anything at all. Game, set, match.
I am. So the opposition has essentially accused me of being both a Leninist and a Nazi. And I during the Holocaust, one of my great-grandfathers was sent to the Gulag by the Soviets. The other was sent to Auschwitz by the Nazis. So all I have to say, sir, is Shabbat Shalom. Well, I understand that it can be difficult to intellectually conceptualize how one should teach global comparative history, to which I would just like to invite you to sit my modules at Newcastle University.
Chat back now.
So, Armando Kanga, Butler College. So, a question for the proposition. So, there's so many people in the past that, despite the great ideas, for example, Aristotle, which he had like questionable opinions about women and slaves, for example. So, why instead of like removing people, authors from the curriculum, we don't just increase teaching about critical thinking? Because we have to stop to think that this time of the history is the best time in history. In 100 years' time, there will be people with different ideas. They will be criticizing us, for example, maybe eating meat, or things we said here that now they are thought to be correct, and then in the future will be wrong. I think this kind of things, like changing curricula, happen naturally, and I've seen it happening within. So why not, rather than remove people, authors from the curriculum, just teach more about critical thinking, what they said, and elaborate on that?
Well, I like eating meat, I'll tell you that. But secondly, look, we're not removing anyone from the curriculum. You said that. Look, I'll say again, no one is being removed. You're all here, okay? Nothing is coming out of the curriculum. And secondly, decolonisation, as my honourable friend has said, is actually about expanding those critical thinking skills. As I said with my Chinese module in first year, I should say, about looking at the Qing Empire and all these various empires, and considering their reactions and interactions with Europe and other continents. Game, set, match.
Well, I come out quite interested, but I think the proposition keeps talking about they're not going to remove anyone from history. But let me tell you this, we live in a finite material world, okay? Universities have finite amount of money, okay? Fundamentally, if you're expanding the curriculum, how are you going to fund that? You're going to have to cut other modules. They haven't addressed this. So, they're just not practical, and it's just an ideology. Okay, so.
Last two questions, please. Yes, chapter second row from back. Glasses.
Nathan Bowes, Colorado College. Well, I do chemistry, so how would decolonisation of the curriculum apply to sciences? Because I think what we've heard most of today is about history and, those sorts of things.
Unless you'd like to join. Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think that for the hard sciences, I can understand why you're asking why is this relevant to us. And I think that there's two answers for that science departments have taken on board. And one is the way in which things are taught. So making sure that students who come from socially and neurologically diverse backgrounds are being included and having an accessible education. And I think a second way, this is specifically relevant to chemistry, but to the sciences in general, it's about the categories of analysis that go into particularly algorithms. So for example, there was a really interesting piece published in, I believe, Science in 2020, so during, in the aftermath of the fallout of the vitamin D research, in fact, arguing that race should be dropped as a category of analysis in biomedical studies. And the reason was, if race doesn't exist, which it does not, then putting in, even if you define race as an ideological and a social category, but if you put it as a category in a spreadsheet, then the algorithm is going to keep spitting out race. When in fact, the example in this article, for example, was that the determining factor, for example, of why African American women in the United States suffer such higher rates of complications at birth is access to health care, not some sort of biological difference. Right? So these are the kinds of things that decolonization asks hard scientists to think about, is what categories of analysis are being used, and are those meaningful categories? Because if they're not, if they're social constructs, if they're ideological constructs, if they're not hard science categories, why are they being used? Because that's just going to continue the confirmation bias of providing evidence for a previously held belief that has been disproven for decades. So I think that's an example of how decolonization can be relevant to the hard sciences.
Well, yes, actually, I mean, it's a very simple point. Are you therefore suggesting that there are not diseases, your example was biomedical, that affect specific groups of the population? Are you saying that we are all the same, and that sickle cell anemia does not preponderantly affect people of Afro-Caribbean origin? Or Tay-Sachs disease, Shabbat Shalom to you too. Tay-Sachs disease affects Jews rather more than other groups? Because if you are, you're turning your back on true biomedical science. We have a human genome project outside Cambridge in this country, and its work is very much focused on how individual groups, different ethnic, different racial, different social groups. The director is my personal friend. I went to school with him, and I've been taken round, and he has shown me and talked to me about precisely these things. If you're saying that race, or indeed background, is not a consideration in biomedical science, then I think you owe this gentleman an apology.
Very quickly, very quickly.
Race was disproven conclusively by the Human Genome Project. You can roll your eyes, sir, if you want. I have A-levels in sciences before I jumped ship. Chemistry was my favorite AP exam, by the way. Race does not exist. The Human Genome Project shows there is no significant difference amongst our species. We are too young. There is more genetic differentiation amongst a hillside of chimpanzees in Uganda than the entire human species. You, sir, are confusing population genetics with race, which is precisely why it's so important that hard scientists help us define our terms so that humanists who are quite narrowly trained in this country and basically opt out of the sciences after GCSE don't get things confused and continue to perpetuate disproven ideas like race. Thank you.
We're getting from the other side an extremely sanitised view of what the decolonised science movement is. I do recommend the question to read Anna Krylov, the chemist, her article, The Perils of Politicising Science, or the stuff by Abhishek Sahar or John Armstrong in response to that. And these people advised the previous government about the whole decolonised science movement in ways which fed into the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act. There is a large movement there which is arguing that any sort of thing that we might call hard science, scientific inquiry, is just a Western construct and it's just a form of domination. And some saying that we should go to simple indigenous ways of knowing without any reason to test them for their scientific validity. It's an anti-science movement, decolonisation, in large measure. It's about judging science on the identity of the people who produce it, not on the validity of the science itself.
Yes, last question, please. Last question. This is your last opportunity. Yes. Yes, chat on the front row.
Question for the proposition, Sebastian Clarkson, Hildenson B. You mentioned neurodivergent individuals as benefiting from the process of decolonialization. I'm maybe as white as they come, and I'm neurodivergent, and I don't see the connection between those two things.
I can explain that. Great, that's a wonderful question. Thank you so much for asking that. I am also neurodivergent, and it's a wonderful gift. So interestingly, pedagogical research shows that traditional assessment methods like timed standardized tests and multiple choice tests actually statistically disadvantage neurologically diverse populations in almost the same statistical measure as socially diverse populations, which is really interesting, right? It's something to unpack. But I think that one of the takeaways from that is that these are just simply really bad, lazy forms of assessment. I would love to give all of my students multiple choice exams that, you know, that are on, used to be Scantron and now we use Canvas could grade for me. That would be wonderful. It would, you know, take care of the 110 essays I have sitting on my computer to mark in the next 2 weeks. But it's really terrible pedagogy. So yeah, it's a really interesting thing that actually statistically multiple large-scale studies have shown. And if you find me at the reception, I can probably get you some receipts for that, some citations.
Thank you.